and amazing scholar Morgan Grove. I could spend the entire hour talking about him because he has accomplished so much and because I know so much about him. But I think instead I'll just do a couple of highlights. So Morgan is with the USDA Forest Service, and he's a team leader of the Baltimore, I wrote it down. The USDA's Forest Service's Baltimore Station.
Field.
Yes, field. I knew I was going to miss a word, but Baltimore Field Station. And if you are wondering why the USDA has a field station in Baltimore, he is going to explain some of that when you hear his talk today. When I first met Morgan, he was living in Vermont. That made so much sense to me. Vermont forests, that all. Then he moved down to Baltimore, and I got very confused. But you'll see, you'll see that his work is amazing. He's a Yale through and through. Don't hold that against him. I've gotten over it. Besides, they're just bulldogs. We're Hoyas, right? Like way better. He has his BA in Architecture and Environmental Studies from Yale, and MFS in Community Forestry, and his PhD in Social Ecology. And so you might guess from his academic history that he's an incredibly interdisciplinary scholar. He works with absolutely everybody and somehow manages to have the most amazing projects. Ecologists, climate scientists, other social scientists, artists. He publishes and does work with all of them. And he makes some of the most beautiful furniture you're ever going to see. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Morgan, and he'll tell you what he's going to talk to you about, and then he'll talk about it.
Okay, thank you. I should add that I spent 2 years at SASINC, and I worked closely with Cindy. And, you know, I think part of the prospect of working at SASINC was the assignments that I was supposed to do, my help to do things. And, you know, if I haven't said it enough, I also learned an incredible amount from Cindy, and that continues to pay dividends today. And so I think that you'll see, or at least Cindy will know, she's like, oh yeah, in all of these ideas that we have. So my task today, what I'd like to speak with you about, is giving you some orientation to where we are in our thinking about urban ecology. What we do in the Baltimore Field Station is we do urban ecology, working with civic organizations, nonprofit organizations, government agencies at the local, state, and federal levels, all to understand the long-term social ecological dynamics of urban areas, Baltimore in particular, and understanding where we've been in order to understand where we are today and where we are likely to be going into the future. We are a mission-oriented research organization, so I'm an R&D for the Forest Service. And when I say that we are mission-oriented, meaning that we do research, we do science to solve problems. We do not do research and science to write papers. Papers may be a happy byproduct, but our job is to solve problems. So with that, in urban ecology, one of the key things is systems thinking. And we'll explain sort of why that occurs. And hopefully that buzzing is in everyone's head, not just mine. And then how that gets applied, and actually how that's a tool for problem solving. So what we'll be going over today is trends in urban ecology, this idea of regenerative urban ecology. And I think that it's an important term in practice to introduce to you all. What is some of the culture and practices that are necessary in order to do that? I'm going to provide 2 case studies for regenerative urban ecology. It'll be one if I'm already going too long when we get through the first one. And then what are some lessons learned? So first is this idea of an ecology in and of cities. And this was a landmark change that occurred in the 1990s in terms of how we thought about urban ecology. So initially, up until that time, we did urban ecology by what I would call by analogy. We would look at a forest in a rural area and we would compare it to a forest in a park. We would look at a vacant lot in the city. We would compare it to abandoned agricultural lands. We would use the same techniques for studying wetlands and streams that we use in rural areas and try to apply it to urban areas. And so we had this analogy, and what the basic idea is in this and why it's important is that we would sort of treat that forest in the park as an island, and we didn't look at anything else surrounding it. So the ecology that we looked at may be very robust, but the social and economic aspects of that forest park were very limited in what we included in our conception of what urban ecology was. We made a shift in the late 1990s, and Stuart Pickett, who's an ecologist, sometimes and most often now known as an urban ecologist, to this idea of a mosaic approach to an ecology of cities, where we look at the entire landscape of the city. And now we're getting out of the parks, we're looking at residential areas, we're looking at commercial areas, industrial areas in terms of land use. And in doing so, not only do we expand the ecological things that we're looking at, but we vastly increase the types of social and economic things that we're looking at as well. And so we go from this idea of matrix, island biogeography, going back, to classic 1950s, 1960s McNaughton kinds of ecologists, where we're looking at an island in a hostile matrix was their phrase, to an expanded mosaic, to an ecology of cities. And in doing so, we're looking at a much larger area, but we're also vastly expanding the types of disciplines and data that we're involving. So then we expand beyond that to where we're saying, okay, not only is our position changing in terms of what gets included in urban ecology, to we say that we're going to shift to really what has been considered to be another phrase for it, and always NSF was catching up with us in terms of how we conceptualize things, to what we call, well, what they would call transdisciplinary science. We called it an ecology with cities, meaning that we are working with the city to solve problems, that there was a role for scientists to solve problems. And in this, and you see in this graph, we make this progression from curiosity-driven research, which is what most universities do, to what NSF pays for, to doing use-inspired research. And we'll return to that term in a little while, but that's the sweet spot for the Forest Service. Like, that is our job, is to do use-inspired research. And Dan Childers, who is at Arizona State, was a leader in thinking about this, to an ecology from for to with. And here when we say with, and this is one of Pickett's slides, is that we're changing the framing of research to say it's justice-inspired research, that we actually care about equity, inclusivity in what we try to do, not just who's involved in doing research, but actually who is served by research occurring. He makes a case, and I just want to introduce these two ideas, which we won't dwell upon. This idea that cities are co-produced, and meaning that the ecology of the city is our active agents in how the city is. For those of us who are foresters, like, our forests are greatly shaped by deer. They are greatly shaped by invasive plants that have come from other places. Often our forests, what appears to be invasive plants are actually the only things that the deer don't like to eat. That's why they spread. That's why they're there. That's why they spread. History is part of that co-production. Most of our forests are shifting dramatically because we no longer have fire used as an active management tool that indigenous populations used for hundreds of thousands of years here. So what we now are having is a colonial forest, or a colonist forest, I would call it, and it is not a good thing, honestly. So it's more than people who produce our environments, but it is the ecology, it is topography, it is a history of glaciation. All of those things are part of what our cities are. So initially, I think people think about, like, well, there was a blank slate and then people came and made up a city. And that's not true. Like, why we have a city where we have it was lots of ecological drivers, and those ecological drivers continue. So that's kind of a progression that we've had to date with an ecology in of for with. We just keep sort of like iPhones. We keep, improving them, but it's still the same iPhone in some ways. So, but I want to push it. I'm personally deeply dissatisfied with that progression because I think it lacks ambition. And I think that we're in big trouble if we're satisfied with that. I think that we have to push this idea that we want to create regenerative urban ecologies. So, the catchphrases here would be, we need to leave it better than we found it. Over the next 50 years, we need to have cities improving. Sustainability is kind of weak, honestly, to say, well, we're okay with just staying where we are, resilient. Okay, fine. No, we've got to move it better. And how do we do that? Is this idea that we need to help our cities work like nature works, that they are complex systems, and that we do not have waste, that material is always getting recycled, and we're kind of letting ourselves off the hook if we accept the idea that there's waste. And in doing so, we need to come up with solutions that solve many problems at the same time. And so one of the ways to frame that is to think about any challenge that you're addressing. Are you leaving it better than you found it? Are you thinking like nature? And how many sustainability development goals, that's the cheat sheet here. How many sustainable development goals are you touching in doing so? And in this slide, here's the sustainable development goals. Like, that's where we are. We want to become regenerative. We want to think like nature. And sustainability is just the halfway point. So if sustainability is your goal, I would say that's weak, right? That is adding no additional harm. What we want to do is restorative, humans doing things to nature, regenerative, human doing things as nature, which goes back to that co-production idea as well. So that's the goal. I would like everyone who gets involved in urban ecology as a practitioner, as a scientist, everyone working together, say, how do we leave it better? And in doing so, how do we think like nature? So one of the major shifts that we have to make, and this is a sort of a slide, it's a book by General McChrystal. He wrote a book called Team of Teams. And he came up with this idea, team of teams, when the US was in Iraq the second time, and they were fighting Al-Qaeda, and they realized that the US military was organized as a complicated system, and Al-Qaeda was a highly adaptive, complex system. And he had to completely reorganize the US military in Iraq in order to take on the challenge that they faced. And he goes beyond that to look at how in the history in the US, throughout the world, that we've taken complex systems and pretended like they're complicated systems. US military is an example. The structure of most municipal governance systems are that way. Universities are trying to figure out, like, when a university is saying we need to do interdisciplinary things, what they're saying is that we are organized in a hierarchical, complicated system, chemistry, physics, so on. But we realize that many of the things we have to address are complex. And so we have to reorganize our departments, and the faculty grumble about that. But we have to reorganize in order to address problems in a new way. And so here's just the way to think about it. Cities have been addressed. Most of how we manage nature has been addressed as though it is a complicated problem. And we have a social organization that treats it as though it is a hierarchical approach. That's our reorganization. But if we acknowledge, and this is important when we're talking about regenerative ecologies, if we acknowledge that the things that we're working on are complex, and we want to leave it better than we found it, then we have to reorganize. We have to change our culture and practices to do it, which McChrystal talks about is this idea of a team of teams. So what are some of the characteristics of team of teams? Their organization typically is that they are small teams, and we move from efficiency to adaptability. Historically, that hierarchical system, part of its metric was how efficient are we? We moved from being efficient to being adaptable. With it, we willingly give up, oh, we're not as efficient, but we're more adaptable. And then trying to convince your superiors about well, how did you measure adaptability? And then you just get down to your axle and sand about that. It's like, no, we're just going to do this. One of the other characteristics that McChrystal talks about in that reorganization that he faces, like, the Navy SEALs thought they were awesome. Army Apache helicopters, they thought they were awesome. But each of them within their own team, they thought everyone else sucks. It's in the book, so, okay. It's like everyone had the attitude. And so you may have, like, in chemistry, everyone in chemistry thinks they're great, but all those people in biology, they all suck, And so what you're trying to move beyond that is this appreciation that goes to this interdisciplinarity. It's like, we may be great, but other people are great too, right? In that culture, it requires building trust. It requires humility, which often is in short supply in many places. We need to have a common purpose. Now we're shifting to that idea of use-inspired research, right? Common purpose, and we have empowerment of individuals to act. We're no longer looking to people above us. And this is part of the importance of adaptability. You have the ability to make changes. So team of teams is actually a fundamental way that we start to operationalize this idea of regenerative urban ecologies. We then need to go to boundary objects. And here, it comes out of computer science. And a couple of years ago, I sent an email note to Mark and said, Mark, boundary objects, what do you know? And there was some help, but there's also a lot of computer software to think about it. It is a practice of thinking about the sociology of science. How do we go and have problems that appear ill-structured, ambiguous, or complex, which is most of the things that we actually face, though we try to pretend they're not. We need to develop team strategies for cooperation without first requiring consensus. How many of you have been on a project where you go around the table and it's like, we first need to create consensus before we can do anything? That was like most of my life, versus I had one person is like, why don't we just start doing things and we'll figure it out as we go? This was deeply unsettling, and it proved to be the best way to go, right? And then we use boundary objects to sit in the middle among different groups. And STAR talks about what those 4 kinds of boundary objects are, and we'll dwell upon one for the moment. Well, actually 2. First is the idea of problems. You go around the room and you start to discuss, well, what is the problem? And that brings people together and be able to contribute their different perspectives of disciplines and data and ideas and theories, methods, in terms of understanding and defining that problem. Second is a place. We might walk around here and we say, okay, Georgetown University, how do you see it from a biology perspective, from a chemistry perspective, from a geological perspective, and so on? And you get a multifaceted view. The third is systems diagrams, which is what we're going to talk about. And there's a lot of connections here between system diagrams and problems. And the fourth is data systems, creating data systems that allow all of these different perspectives to come together. So boundary objects, and I think the study of boundary objects, how they're operationalized, this was a huge topic at SISC, was how do we do interdisciplinary research in the use of boundary objects to do this? Now, what is our role? So I'm going to pretend for a moment you all are researchers. Like, what is our role in doing research? Again, coming back to this idea of use-inspired research. If you want to get tenure, you do basic research. And part of the definition, perversely, about basic research is you're not trying to actually solve a practical problem. You're trying to advance theory. You're trying to advance methods. Stokes, when he wrote the book about what he calls Pasteur's quadrant, he labeled the first box pure basic research and described in terms of the physicist Niels Bohr. The other box is Edison. Edison was a fantastic researcher and scientist, and create all sorts of things, all sorts of patents, most fundamentally advancing the light bulb, which transforms society. Among other things, buildings stopped burning down because, Mrs. O'Leary's, candle didn't get knocked over and burns down Chicago, so it just was a fundamental change. But he had no interest in advancing theory or methods. So you have those two that are positioned out there. I think that the place that I'm arguing for and where I spend my life is, and now I'm going to sound like to ever claim that I'm up there with Pasteur is, completely off. But, what Stokes referred to it as Pasteur's quadrant. So Louis Pasteur both made fundamental changes to our understanding of microbiology and advancing theory and methods, but he also created pasteurization. Well, he created a thing that got named for him, which saved, countless millions of lives of children who were not dying because of spoiled food, spoiled milk, and so on. And so we want to kind of live there, which is that we do two things at the same time. It is possible to advance theory and methods and also paying attention to solving a problem. And that we can live there in this happy place, and ideally we still get tenure, right? But that's kind of situating where we live. And you don't have to pick one or the other. You don't have to pick to be Niels Bohr or Thomas Edison. Like, there is a place, and there was a fantastic scientist who did very well there. And I just want to encourage you to defend yourself if you want to live there, right? And it is essential for us, again, to advance urban ecology. So what are the roles of research, if we're going to do this? So we need to organize existing knowledge and data into systems of components and interactions. And here we're starting to draw upon this idea of boundary objects, that there are ecological and social components that co-produce the system. That we need linkages, feedbacks, and leverage points. We need to identify where they are. Now we're starting to think like nature in a complex system. And we need to have organizational analysis for teams. Like, who do I need on the team? And then who do I need to add to the team once I realize I don't know enough about the issue? We need to identify and reduce uncertainties and unknowns. So Spaceship Challenger, it goes down because they were operating the spaceship in an area that they had no knowledge about. And they're like, well, we think that O-ring will be fine. Wasn't so good, right? So what are our uncertainties and unknowns? Are we still safe to operate the system, right? And then we need to quantify the positive and negative outcomes. Verify the effectiveness of our actions. Here we're seeking to be adaptable and resilient. We need to market the value of these activities. Like, what is it worth? Are we saving people money? And then support adaptive management and learning, which is often in short supply in decision-making. Like, no one sticks around long enough to see whether it worked or not, and then to make adjustments. They sort of implement, and then they're moving on to the next thing. So, okay, here's the madness. So this is something that I worked on. And what is it about? So in the city of Baltimore, well, larger picture, I got assigned in the Forest Service to tackle the question of urban wood utilization, urban wood reuse. And what got the Forest Service's attention at a very high level was some research that indicated that there's more wood going from urban areas into landfills than is harvested from our national forests. So my national forest guys, they're like, yeah, that's because we don't harvest enough. And I'm like, okay, yeah, we'll leave that alone. But it gives you an idea of the magnitude of the amount of woody material that's going into landfills, wood that's being treated as a waste. Now, if we recall, one of the fundamental ideas of regenerative urban ecologies or regenerative ecologies is there's no such thing as waste. Okay, well, we have a complicated system that is treating a material as though it is a waste. We need to become a complex system that is treating it as something of an asset that can be reused. In addition, we have very high levels of unemployment in Baltimore. We have a situation where at any one time in a neighborhood, 1/3 of all the men are in jail. We have a system where recidivism means you get arrested, you go to jail, you get out of jail, you get arrested, you go back to jail. So that cycle, recidivism rates are about 48%. Cost of incarceration in the city of Baltimore, well, the state of Maryland is $37,000. Cost of incarceration in the state of Georgia is $92,000. Cost of incarceration in the state of California is $125,000. So we also know in the city of Baltimore, if you have a household income of $25,000, you are a stable family. So cost of incarceration greatly exceeds what would be a stable household in terms of expenditures, right? So we got some things. So my first task in this, and I guess I should take a step back. A fundamental idea throughout this is the idea of co-production. And here I'm not just talking about disciplines, I'm talking about people from the private sector, I'm talking about community associations. Like, if you have a pulse, you can be part of co-production, right? I don't care what the name of your seat is. And a team of teams is a means by which to do co-production. Boundary objects is a means by which to do co-production. The systems diagram is one of those 4 examples. And it is a means by which to do co-production. It's also tied to a place, Baltimore, which is another boundary object, and it's also tied to a problem or set of problems, which is also a form of a boundary object. So this is kind of a synthesis of co-production that we have. And part of my job, I was trying to explain to my kids, they're like, oh, what do you do? And I said, I listen to a lot of people and I figure out, is it an elephant or is it a duck-billed platypus? Like all of our problems, none of them are like cheetahs, right? They're all sort of this amalgam of all these different things. And my job is to synthesize that and kind of put a skin around it. And in doing so, I worked with one of Mark Malouf's professors, and this guy, Don Newt, who's a really fantastic guy. And Don Newt did decision support systems of all sorts of types. And I said to Don, oh, what do you do? And he says, oh, he did knowledge elicitation. And then he described to me, and I realized just saying knowledge elicitation, I was like, wow, you must get paid a lot of money. And then I asked him, like, okay, well, how do you do that? And he says, well, we ask people a lot of questions, we learn stuff, and then we formalize that. And I was like, oh, well, I should say that I do that too. But what I do is I ask people lots of questions and then I formalize what I learn. This is an example of formalizing, what I learned from a lot of different people. This is a co-produced thing. And there's no way that, when I started this, all I understood was how to grow trees that then became fresh cut. Like I only understood one box, but I ended up learning all these other boxes. And so we start on one side with, we have wood and in Baltimore, and wood comes from fresh cut, meaning trees that are cut down as part of maintenance, parks, street trees, stuff like that. Just within the public resource in Baltimore City, that's 9,000 tons of wood. It is about 10% of all the wood that is flowing in and out of Baltimore in a year. So, do the math. It's like about 100,000, we'll round up, about 100,000 tons of wood. DC, similar in terms of the amount of wood. They also have a wood operations like we do in Baltimore of taking those trees and reusing them as logs and producing furniture. Earl Usler, who works here in the city, is awesome. So we have fresh cut that's going into wood. We have buildings that are being deconstructed. In Baltimore, we have about 17,000 vacant homes. Rather than demolish them and treat them like waste, we can deconstruct them and reuse about 90% of all the material. That would be good. And rather than having that wood go to landfills, we have it go to wood utilization. Out of that urban wood utilization, we create a number of different wood products. Those wood products can go and be taken and used by various types of producers. We work a lot with Taylor Guitar, who's in California. They're using urban wood. Taylor Guitar is awesome. They have 2 urban wood guitars, by the way, all you guitar players. We work with Room and Board. They have 2 stores here in Baltimore. Here in DC, I gotta realize I don't live in Baltimore. So, who are using urban wood in their furniture lines. Sandtown Furniture, they're using lots of urban wood. They are also in Baltimore. They charge $1,000 per linear foot for their dining room tables. So you can do the math on an 8-foot long dining room table. So there's lots of things that we could make with this stuff. A lot of this material can become what we call part of a circular supply chain for tree planting and tree maintenance. This box of stewardship, if we have stewardship and we're planting more trees, USDA Forest Service put out $1.5 billion for tree planting initiatives last year. That's from a budget the year before of 30 million. So we're making an investment. If we have stewardship, we're creating more fresh cut. Eventually these trees will die. But if we have stewardship, we're also reducing the impacts of pests, pathogens, storms, climate change. So that's a good. And so green is positive change, red is negative change. Negative is a systems term, not a normative term. If we have stewardship, then we're also addressing canopy cover, improving safety, reducing urban heat island, improving water quality, promoting sustainability, resilience, and we should eventually put down here regenerative ecologies. So we got the wood thing going on there. We're also with wood utilization, we're creating profits, but we have the employment thing that we talked about too. So if we have employment, if we increase employment, we reduce recidivism. What we found, what I learned in all of this is if you have 2 years of employment, your recidivism rate goes to 0, pretty much 0. You're not going back, particularly if we can also, you can generate an income enough to actually buy a home. Homeowners, don't find many homeowners who are criminals, at least with our work in Baltimore. If I increase home ownership, I reduce vacancy. If I reduce vacancy, then that's going to have an effect on property values. If I reduce vacancy, I'm also having an effect on deconstruction. I would like to have fewer homes to take down, right? I reduce recidivism. I reduce the expenditures of incarceration. If I increase employment, I also reduce the expenditures on social welfare. If I have the second level producers, I'm also creating employment. So in this analysis, one of our goals was to make the connections between all that wood stuff. You know, basically my charge was don't let the wood go into landfills, to addressing other employment things. Now, what I would start to suggest to you is 2 different things. One of which is you can get paid a lot if you help someone avoid a cost. We too often conceptualize things as creating profit, but it is very expensive to send things to a landfill. It is very expensive for someone to go to the emergency room. It is very expensive for someone to have to be locked up in jail. It is very expensive to do stormwater management. If you can start to solve one of those things, you're saving people money. And I'm not a greedy bastard. I just want 20%. Just want 20 cents on the dollar for everything I saved you. But if I'm going to do landfills, but I'm also doing recidivism, I'm also keeping people out of jail, I'm also doing stormwater management, and I'm also ideally helping people become more healthy. So this becomes, one, a data map of everything that is going on. It also becomes a financial investment map. It becomes an organizational map, like who all is involved with each one of these things. This allows me to go, okay, well, I'm building the knowledge system. Now I can start to think about my team of teams in order to take this on. The other important thing is now start to map the sustainability development goals to this. I'm hitting a lot of them. And I'm saying but I really mean we, the team, the program, we're hitting a lot of the sustainable development goals. And so with one solution, we're touching many things, which I think has to be the hallmark of regenerative urban ecologies. So this gives you a system, an idea that we can actually operationalize this. We can go from, okay, here's how we think about things. Here's our goal. Okay, now how do we start to put this into place? It requires a different way of doing things. But, you know, at the way we're going, it's sort of like Edison. Like if you keep doing the same thing and expecting different results, it's a form of insanity, right? And we're kind of living a world of insanity. So we've got to think about things in a different way. But this is also, in addition to solving problems, you know, creating all sorts of new knowledge and methods for our understanding of how these systems work. So we're still happily situated within Pasteur's quadrant. How am I doing on time, Cindy? Okay, so our next example that I'd like to show, as I mentioned, we have about 17,000 vacant lots, vacant homes in Baltimore. We have about 20,000 vacant lots. And if you've driven through Baltimore, you would see it. But, you know, and if you, back in the day, in the 90s, when I worked in DC, we had a lot of vacant lots too, right? Detroit, like you name any post-industrial city, it's not unique to Baltimore. So going back to the previous slide, this is what the buildings look like before we deconstruct them. And I said to you, we take about 90% of that material. What the material that we can't take, it has lead paint on it, and it's just no go, right? But all the brick, well, and someone's come in and taken all the copper out ahead of us, right? So we got brick and wood is what we're taking. That gets taken out, and then the basements get filled, and then they create a park. But they create a park and they don't have any money to take care of it. So our challenge was like, okay, what do we do in order to create a system where we actually are generating enough revenue, or we have some new financial instruments by which to maintain these parks? Where we should have stopped on the urban wood side, a big shift was when we cut down the trees, rather than cutting them down into like 3-foot lengths and then chipping them all, we cut down the trees to the longest length practical. So we're cutting down trees and we're retaining logs that are 8, 16, 24 feet long. We actually had an ash tree that came in that was 50 feet long. So we're taking it down in that full length. So what does that got to do here? We filled the basements. So this will come up, like we should not fill the basements. We should create cisterns in there, and we should move all the stormwater in there and store it when we have lots of rain and hold on to it when it's really hot and we have droughts. So first is like, let's look at our practices and see whether or not it creates an opportunity. Okay, so this is what it starts to look like. This is a redesign. And the design of the park is oriented towards how do we solve as many sustainable development goals as possible, and how do we pay for it? Like that's the first thing. And like the landscape architects, they don't like this. They're like, no, I want to make a beautiful park. I'm like, no. You got to make the park so that we can afford to take care of it. And that doesn't mean like low cost things. It means we have to generate value from the park. And they're like, yeah, but you know, recreation is survival. No, I'm like, no. We got to monetize this. And I'm not trying to be a capitalist. What I'm just trying to say is we got to solve some other people's problems in doing this. And so what we have in plan here, and I'll show you what it looks like in section, but the plan is you have this amphitheater here, and the seating is, it's amphitheater seating. Underneath the amphitheater is that what had been the basement. And this roof to the amphitheater collects water. It also has solar power and batteries so that it's storing energy. And so when we lose the overall electrical grid, we're still generating electricity and people can charge their phones, but it's collecting all the water, and the water is being stored underneath. And then we also have storage over here. I should add that these solar panels are also used as solar pumps to pump the water out when we need it. Then here's what it looks like in section. So here's the amphitheater, here's the old basement, there's the old basement, solar up here. And where am I getting paid for this? You know, so that may be the question. We go to this. And so I teach urban ecology. I make my students do one of these diagrams every week from the readings, and they hate it at the beginning, and then I'd like to think that they start liking it at the end. But this is what it starts to look like. Okay, we still have sort of like that employment sector model that we talked about in the previous example, but now we're connecting it to neighborhood revitalization where we have the parks. So we have that vacancy that was familiar, going to deconstruction. With deconstruction, I create vacant land. With vacant land, I create parks. That goes to neighborhood revitalization. But what I'm also doing is I'm solving these things. Solving these things here. So we're doing water capture, we're doing water treatment because I've installed biofilters into the system. We're doing water storage. That water storage can be used for irrigation, can also be used for cooling. And here's something that is an unexploited, unexplored thing, which is everyone complains about the urban heat island. I do too. You have a huge thermal mass in all of this material. If you've ever been to Southwest United States, right? Go to a restaurant, you see the misters. Everyone's like, oh, it's so nice, right? So that is a localized mister. It's using energy to produce it. I have all of this hot streets, all of this thermal mass in the streets and the buildings. What we have been able to demonstrate and model is if I apply 1 inch of water to the street, just stream flow, it evaporates and cools locally by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is sort of it's an intermediate scale mister, versus your restaurant. Like I can start to use the entire street infrastructure of a city to cool it. I got all this heat. I also have all this water that I've been storing for 3 months down there to irrigate, but also to use in this sort of like, neighborhood scale misting. So I can cool by 10 degrees. I have the solar microgrid, and I can reuse materials from my building deconstruction to make the parks, right? So in doing so, I'm addressing precipitation in terms of flooding and stormwater quality. I'm addressing drought and improving plant health. I'm addressing heat waves and mortality. Of all the things that it's going to kill people with climate change, it's going to be heat waves. Already is, right? Heat waves kill more people than everything else combined, tornadoes, hurricanes. So this is a big thing we got to solve. And then also severe storms and electrical supply. So we are creating this micro infrastructure, and we can get paid for solving, in particular, heat waves and mortality. Like that is a cost that we incur in terms of public health and health insurance, and then solving stormwater quality. So Baltimore City has a budget of $30 million per year for addressing stormwater quality. Again, I'm not a greedy bastard. Like I just want some of that to pay the staff to help take care of this thing. Like I can find lots of capital money to build it. Taking care of it is where it's hard. And if I can get people paid to take care of it, then the neighborhood's way more excited about having it installed as well. So some lessons learned. It is critical that we take a systems view and identify multiple feedbacks that are part of these complex systems. Make connections among the parts. We need to have openness and aspiration to address multiple sustainability development goals. So it's well printed what those are. Like when you're working on a team, it's like, okay, how many of them are hitting? Okay, we got 3. Can we get 5? Can we get 8? Really kind of push ourselves as part of that regenerative urban ecology, which goes to this idea that we have one solution to solve many problems. We need to acknowledge challenges, aspirations, and not quite right situations. There are some things that at the moment are going to be hard to solve. So we just have to say, okay, it's not ready to get onto the diagram, or maybe it's on the diagram, but we're not ready to take it on. It is fundamental that we become really good at this idea of a team of teams. I think that we really got to focus on how we train them. And I think that there could be a science of team of teams, right? Certainly, General McChrystal's getting paid a lot in consulting fees in order to teach people how to do it. It's sort of like that knowledge elicitation, right? Still asking questions. I'll keep it simple. I think we still should be pushing this, where we can bring together particular knowledges and capacities to a more complete understanding. We shouldn't be going sequentially from the engineers to the landscape architects and so on. How do we bring them together? And here again, this idea that there should be science and resources for training and transboundary practices and culture. That's a sort of a sentence version of saying co-production. I think that Succinct was a fantastic place to do it. I think that we need more of it within city government, emergency response, like all sorts of areas where society really needs the ability for small teams to be adaptable, to solve problems. That is going to be a recurring issue that we have for the next 30 years. And I think that we need to become better at doing it. And with that, thank you very much.
time for some questions. I'm gonna let Morgan call on people himself rather than me do it for him. So if you have any questions or comments for Morgan, please raise your hand.
Yes, sir.
Are there any specific resources, titles, or books that would help someone create diagrams for different systems like you've shown there?
Yeah, so there's a program called Lucid Chart that my students like to use, but they for doing this, it's basically systems mapping. And you know, to be honest, like systems mapping has been around for a long time. Danella Meadows, you know, did a fantastic job. There was a software program, which I don't know if it exists anymore, called Stella, which did this.
I guess I wasn't speaking specifically of like a technological program to draw a line,
Yeah,
but more
Got it.
A framework to ask the right questions, to find the right connections, and to visualize the system more appropriately.
well, I think Succinct has a phenomenal set of resources about this idea of systems diagramming and knowledge. I would caution that I think, you know, how to ask the right questions, you could get stuck trying to know what is the right question. I think you just start asking questions and with time you realize, oh, that was a better question than the other. Just, I mean, a willingness to be ugly. You know, I just want to encourage people, like, you know, people get wound up with like, well, I got to get the right question. I'm like, no, you guys just start asking questions, you know, and say like, what do we think? And a willingness to revise. And why I guess I mentioned Lucid Chart, like I do everything in PowerPoint, like, and I learned from Cindy, like I do a huge amount of stuff in Excel because I'm not stuck in a Word document, like, is this in the right order? And it's just like, I can't keep track, but remember we did this, right? You know, in Excel, it's just like, I keep moving stuff around, you know, what's connected to what, because I don't want to get precious. I guess the key is like, I don't worry about being right and I don't worry about being precious. I just want to go fast or fast-ish. Or I don't want to get stuck and go slow. Maybe I'm trying to not go slow and get stuck. But it's the sort of co-production is either you're going around and you're the knowledge elicitation person getting paid lots of money, or it's like 10 of us in a room and we're willing to like put stuff up on a whiteboard to say like, what I say boxes are nouns and the connections are verbs. And so it's like, okay, what are the things? Those are nouns. And the way I teach it is it's like how to parse a sentence. Parsing a sentence is nouns, verbs, you know, main clauses, dependent clauses, and it's just like dissecting the system. But boxes are nouns, connections are verbs. But again, Succinct, I think, is the best place that I know of to look at this stuff. And there have been a couple books on transdisciplinary science that have also come out. Yes, Cindy, no, I'll go to you.
So just for folks who don't know what Succinct is, the National Socio-Environmental Business Center.
I should have worn my Succinct shirt.
There you go. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the partnerships and how you developed between the wood side of your diagram and the employment. I know there are a lot of like very cool partnerships that were created. Just a little bit more about how that works.
Yeah, so we have the wood side, but then in building deconstruction, but then you start to look at, you're trying to like flesh out your team and it's like but the employment people are trying to find like, oh, what are new opportunities? And so you start looking for other people to work with you and talk with them. And then you start to feel like, oh, is this a good fit? Like, do they want to be on this team? Culturally, you know, so in social sciences, we teach that that there's play, game, and sport. So play is there are no rules and there's no external enforcement of those rules. So you see like 4-year-olds go onto the playground and they're running around, like one person runs up and they're like, hey, do you want to play? And they're like, yeah, let's do that. And they're running around and you're the parent and you're like, you don't understand what they're doing, but they seem to be having a lot of fun. You're like, okay. Then game is you have rules, but there's no external enforcement. So like you're out on the playground. I'm going somewhere with this, which is you're out of the playground in elementary school and you're playing kickball and like, you know, everyone enforces the rules. And then you have sport, which is, you know, there are people with black and white shirts on and so on. When you're trying to find partners, it's important to find people who like to play. most of us have lost the ability to play. Because we're in a university and that is in a form of people with black and white shirts and so on, because there's rules and those rules are being enforced. But you need to, come back to in the team of teams, like, let's play with these ideas. Like you asked about, like, what is the software, places, resources, but there's a cultural thing. And I should probably revise the slide, which is you need to be willing to play and doing it. And you're going around trying to find other people who want to play in this. And you keep, in sociology, well, different social sciences, there's something called the snowball method, where you ask a person and you keep going. And so you have to say, well, who can I go talk to who knows something about employment? Who can I go talk to who knows something about theories of criminal justice and recidivism? And you keep trying to find those people who want to play, even though it's very strange that it's a forester who just, started the whole conversation by wood. So there also has to be a willingness to just look stupid and ask questions. And they're like, what are you doing here? Man with plaid and beard, and just go talk to people. So that's how we got this really unique set of partnerships to come about. Is a willingness to just go ask questions and then, cautiously say, here's the diagram so far. What do you think you can contribute? Like, oh, well, you got to fix this and that's wrong and that's stupid. And okay, well, you need this. And hey, this sounds like really fun. Let's keep doing this. So that systems diagram in a way becomes the playground, sense. Yeah. And I'll go back.
Yeah, actually, that kind of answered my question, but.
Okay.
Maybe just to expand a little bit more niche, some of your data are likely data that might be something a company or an organization wants to protect in some way. How do you kind of get to some of that knowledge?
Solve one of their problems. No, seriously. The only organization I've not been able to penetrate is Baltimore Gas and Electric, because the lawyers get involved. Like, no matter how much I'm going to solve their problems. But for instance, like the arborists, they're all like they're willing to be frenemies, but about their operations and what their income is. But to them, wood is a cost. And when they're working on margins of a nickel and you can save them 2 cents, then they become really excited about working with you. But yeah, solve a problem of theirs.
But offering the possibility of solving a problem. You're not sort of like, you don't already have a problem at hand before you have.
Sometimes we do.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes we do. Sometimes we need more information so that we can convince people who want to be investors that there's more payback than we had originally thought. Or we're trying, any business operation hates uncertainty. So the more that we can get uncertainty to zero with more data, there are more people who are likely to want to participate. That's an MBA thing. Like, I didn't know anything about that until I started talking with the business people. And then I learned to say all the time, businesses hate uncertainty. I also learned to say, well, we'll just sell a futures contract on that. I don't really knew what that was until I started hanging out with MBA people, right? They have all sorts of ways to sell you things that they don't have yet. Yeah. So that was one thing I learned. Yeah. But it's another thing is like, it's a huge learning tool. Like, it's a willingness to play, humility that you don't have to know everything, and willingness to learn. And, those are some of the key kind of predispositions or what you learn to do back there. Yeah.
Well, it was great to see you making connections between teams, but I was wondering, why you make new connections sometimes to break some existing relationships.
Yeah, well, we're trying to in some cases.
Yeah, and how do you wean the legacy of the system? Do you consider okay, some people are already making money or livelihood with the existing connection, which you're gonna break with your new way of doing stuff. Do you consider them or their, it will be a short-term thing, but do you have any importance to the existing and taking it slowly weeding off and then making the connection, or are you?
Well, I'll give you 2 examples. One of which is, we want to address barriers to employment. Often those are the result of institutionalized racism. So we're going against dominant white power structures and breaking those. I don't really have a problem with that. We have, in the case of Baltimore, one contractor. So now, item 2. We have, in the case of Baltimore, a contractor who has most of the demolition contracts. He was not happy that he was losing a lot of business to the deconstruction contracts. He donated a very large amount of money to the mayor's campaign, and the deconstruction contracts ended. So now, one of the council members has contacted me and said, "What's up with this?" Because she wants to see more building deconstruction. And I started to describe what happened. She goes, "Oh, I know him." So him might be facing a new situation. But
The other side of the graph.
on the other side of the graph, but yeah, I mean, lots of the disconnections are really more political than, but you're also creating lots of winners because you've stopped treating things as a waste and you've been creating value. It is important to make sure that those people who are the beneficiaries of value also realize that they have political power that they may never have had before, and for them to learn how to exert that political power. Like that is, it seems to me like that's professional malpractice if you don't advise them of that. Case in point, the state forester for Maryland serves at the pleasure of the governor. We got a new governor. People in Baltimore were not happy with the existing state forester because he was a racist. And I reminded him that, my friend, said the governor, the state forester serves at the pleasure of the governor. And they're like, "Okay, well, we're going to create a position paper." I'm like, "No, you just write a letter." And they're like, "Wait." And I said, institutionalized racism isn't that smart, right? Just write a letter. Like, you don't need a position paper. So the week later, the state forester came in to find out that his position was he was no longer needed. So my point is that politics are involved here, power is involved here. Like any model of a social ecological system that doesn't include power and racism and greed is an unconvincing model. So you just got to pay attention to it. And just because you're doing good doesn't mean that you don't have to pay attention to power, right? But that's a great question, right? Is, if there are people who do not benefit from the changes in the system, and how are they likely to respond? So now you're looking at it as a scenario tool, right? But it's also a theory of change too.
It's 12:30.
Okay.
So I'd like for us to make Morgan again. I know that there is a lunch organized for Morgan.
Don't look at me. I don't know.
So thank you all so much for coming today. This is our first in our semester-long Eco Talk series. So